Well, good afternoon. Nice to have an intimate conversation of this kind. That was the question that I was given. Is the government doing enough? And obviously, the answer to that question depends on what you think it should be doing. So, I'm going to address 4 issues. We'll talk a little bit about the Green Deal, perhaps. What should it be doing? Or should it, or must it, in order to meet the targets that it set itself? What is it doing? Is this enough? So there's the question I was asked. And could it do more? That's what it should be doing if we are to keep average global warming to below 2 degrees centigrade, which the global community has decided it would like. Sometimes it says it must do it, but at the moment it's not doing it. You'll see that that requires global emissions to start falling before 2020, whereas they're now rising faster than they've ever risen before, to something like a fifth or a sixth of the level that they will otherwise reach towards the end of this century. And with 9 billion people, you can see that that means falling to a global average of less than 1 ton of CO2 per person, whereas in EU countries we're currently at 3 to 4 tons, and in the United States it's about twice that. So there is clearly a big challenge. This is not something that the UK government is trying to address alone, and it's very important to be aware of that. I'm sure you will have had earlier presentations on the international framework of policy. The international scene is driven by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and until the end of this year at least, by the Kyoto Protocol. And then there are various other processes in the G20, the European Union. I'll talk a bit about that because that's very important for the UK and what the government should be doing, national policies and programs, and then various subnational processes. The international state of play is that everyone agrees that we have to have global cooperation. All countries are in principle committed to the prospect of legally binding agreement, and that was the major change at Durban last year in the Conference of the Parties to what existed before. The major developing countries all agreed that we would need a legally binding agreement, and the hope is that this will be agreed by 2015 in order to come into play by 2020. And if you think back to the first slide, global emissions need to have started falling by then if we are to meet the 2-degree target. The fact of the matter is that developing countries won't sign up to anything that they think will have a negative impact on their development, which they still largely define as their rate of economic growth. We can say that they shouldn't define it as such. There are other development indicators which are at least 20 years old, which provide a better way of thinking about development, but unfortunately economic growth still rules supreme in most policymakers' minds, especially at the current time. So that for a country like the UK, which has a very small proportion of global emissions, the task really is to show that we can reduce emissions without having a negative impact on our economic growth. Of course, no one will know whether we're having a negative impact on our economic growth because we won't know what it would have been if we hadn't done these things. So there's plenty of scope for debate and argument, and you'll be aware of that, and you will have heard quite a bit of it actually even within the current government. One doesn't have to look across the different parties. I'm spending most of my academic life now thinking about this concept of green growth, which I wrote about in a book in the year 2000, and which seems suddenly rather in a rather unlikely way, to have acquired legs. The OECD now has a major green growth strategy, and various other countries are busy thinking about this. Chris Hume, before he departed, was a great advocate of green growth, and some of you may have seen his article in The Guardian a day or two ago, where he was basically putting the green growth argument that in fact we won't get any kind of growth in the future if resource problems and climate change problems are not addressed. Quite the reverse, we'll start going backwards economically, and therefore green growth is likely to be the only sort of growth that's on offer. Whether it will be as fast as the kind of brown growth that we've had historically is a different matter, but that's the kind of argument. Anyway, back to the main theme, which is the government doing enough? The government is required to do certain things by our membership of the European Union. The European Union has passed, and what that means is that elected ministers from European member states have passed. If you read the Eurosceptic newspapers, you get the impression that Brussels passes laws and then imposes them on unwilling member states. Well, that of course is nonsense. What happens is that the European Commission proposes legislation which is then discussed by the Council of Ministers, which are the elected ministers from the different member states, and the Parliament, and through a co-decision procedure those laws are amended and agreed or rejected. So all these commitments that we have under our membership of the European Union have been democratically agreed by elected persons. So this 2020 by 2020 trips rather nicely off the tongue, which was doubtless why it was framed in that way. 20% cuts in carbon emissions, which the UK is currently arguing should be increased to 30%, 20% of renewable energy by 2020, and a 20% reduction in energy use below what it would otherwise be through measures such as the Green Deal energy efficiency measures.
I was asking, if you reduce energy use by 20%, and number one is automatically satisfied?
Well, no, because it's below what it would otherwise have been, and it was on a rising trajectory. No one knows what it would otherwise have been, of course, but energy and economic models project that to 2020 and have done, so that there are numbers, and that's why those two things are not necessarily coterminous. There is a significant overlap, you're quite right, between those 20s. Obviously, renewable energy will help meet the carbon emission reduction targets. Energy efficiency measures mean that we use less energy than we might otherwise, and therefore that also helps meet the carbon emissions targets. You can see there what that has translated into for the UK, and again these were targets that were agreed by our elected ministers. The renewable energy target particularly agreed by Tony Blair in 2006. And we are signed up to 15% of renewable energy and final energy demand, split between electricity, heat and transport in those kinds of percentages. And there is an EU emissions trading scheme which was introduced, which has split carbon emissions into two kinds, those that can be traded at the European level, which is about 50% of European emissions, and those which are non-traded, and the 16% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions from 2005, that relates to the non-traded emissions. The traded emissions, of course, are controlled by the cap, which is due to be reduced up to 2020. So that's the framework within which the government has to operate. What's it doing? It's actually responded in the most extraordinarily creative fashion, and that refers as much to the last government as it does to this one. One of the nice things of living in the UK at the moment is that this is a non-party political issue, largely, unlike in the United States. So we passed a Climate Change Act with all-party support. What that did was accept those really quite ambitious targets of an 80% cut in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and now a 34% cut by 2020, and that's enshrined in the legislation, and that would get us on track, and if other industrial and developing countries did something similarly appropriate, that would get us on track for the kind of emissions trajectory I showed right at the beginning. Realising that 2050 is a long way away, and even 2020 is well outside the term of office of any one government, starting from where we are. There are 5-year budgets which are recommended by the Committee on Climate Change and then either accepted or not by the government, and so far they have all been accepted, in order to make sure that those targets are met, and the government has to report on a regular basis against its achievement or otherwise of those targets. So those are the first 3 carbon budgets that were set and that are statutory, and the red line is the government's projection of how it's doing and how emissions will develop through to the end of the decade. And you can see that it is projecting that it will meet those 3 budgets. Each budget consists of a certain tonnage of carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases that's given there, so that you can work out that in the middle of each 5-year period, more or less, you have to be halfway there, so you have to be crossing that step of each of those blocks before the halfway mark in order to be certain of getting there. Last June, the government agreed the 4th carbon budget, which is that one in blue on the far right, and that amounts to a 50% cut from 1990 by 2025, which is the middle of that budget 4 period. So you can see these are now statutory obligations which need to be met under law, which of course gives them a considerably greater weight than previous targets of this kind that we have had. I won't go into what the difference is between those 2 bars is for the moment. We can come back to that if you're interested, and we have time at the end. Well, of course, reducing carbon emissions is only one objective of energy policy, which is one of the reasons why it's such a complicated business. There is also the matter of energy security. UK more or less went to sleep on energy policy up until the year 2000 because we were self-sufficient in oil and gas from the North Sea. From the year 2000, that happy situation came to an end, and in the years since then, we've become increasingly more dependent on world oil and gas markets in order to import the fossil fuels that we need, and you will be aware that prices are pretty high, and that therefore is a significant concern. The increasing discoveries and excitement about unconventional sources of gas, most notably shale gas, means that we're less worried than we were about the prospect of sourcing very large quantities of gas from Russia, but nevertheless there's an issue that if we were to depend for much more than 50% of our power generation and all our heat on imported gas, that this would leave us quite vulnerable to potential global disruptions. And then of course there are issues of affordability. Low carbon energy sources are currently more expensive than high carbon energy sources, and all the discussion that we've seen in the media recently about fuel bills is related to some extent to the fact that this shift to low carbon energy sources is going to cost money, and that will mean that energy bills will go up. There's a lot of misinformation in the media about this, as about so many other things on this agenda. A number of bodies seeking to show that the great majority of the price increases that we've seen since 2005 are due to these so-called green policies. Well, that's absolute nonsense. The great majority of the price increases are due to the increased wholesale price of gas and oil, which has shot up enormously, so that the green policies have induced a price increase, but nothing like as large as some people say. At the same time, obviously this is a concern when the economy is not doing very well, when there are large numbers of people unemployed and needing to keep warm. So that's what our Department of Energy and Climate Change is faced with in terms of challenge, and what I'm now going to do briefly is just discuss how it's responding. The landmark report of Nicholas Stern, now Lord Stern, in 2007, really expressed in very good summary form what sorts of policies we need. We need carbon pricing, first of all. Anything that's free is going to be overused, and if it's scarce, it will be very soon become much more scarce. So this gentleman down at the front here who started talking about carbon taxes, absolutely spot on, in my view and in the view of every economist I know. And as we'll see, the government is acting on that within the limits of political feasibility. At the same time, we need technology policy. There are some economist diehards who think that all we need is a carbon price, but the balance of scientific literature is very clear that although a carbon price over time would develop low carbon technologies, they won't do it anything like fast enough. And so targeted technology support for low carbon technologies is also required. Nick Stern was quite clear about that, and most countries are quite clear about that, including the UK, although you do get a sniping again from some sort of very economically correct people who think that all we need is for prices to be pushing us in the right direction. And then we've got the third set of issues to do with behaviour change. That was the subject of the last presentation. Prices, of course, do affect behaviour, and they affect energy behaviours as other behaviours, and there's a very large academic literature on the subject of price elasticity, which measures the extent to which people respond to changes in price. But again, they don't respond as economists would like them to respond in a perfectly rational way. There are all sorts of barriers and obstacles and misperceptions which other kinds of policies can perhaps help to clear up. So those are the three big sorts of policy. I've now got a number of very busy slides which I'm not going to spend any real time on because the message that I want them to put across is that there has been a quite extraordinary quantity of policy innovation in this area over the last 10 or 15 years. As an academic, you'll have noticed that I'm a professor of environmental policy. As a professor of policy, it's been a marvellous time to be alive because the number of new policy instruments that get dreamt up and then implemented is more than one could ever have dreamt of 30 or 40 years ago. And obviously that all adds grist to the mill, and we can have a look and see how effective they are. But the one thing you can't accuse the government of is lack of imagination. So there are whole rafts of policies. There are four broad kinds of policies that people categorise and think about. Economic instruments are the first set. These are the kinds of policies that control prices directly, and I've listed they either reduce prices or they increase prices. Taxes increase prices, subsidies obviously reduce it, feed-in tariffs are one sort of subsidy. We've got the Green Deal now, that's essentially a financing mechanism, as we heard. We've got a Green Investment Bank, that was in the Queen's speech. So a huge number of different policies have been introduced over the last 10 years. So those are the economic instruments. There have also been regulations, the most important of which in this field is the renewables obligation, which obliges the energy suppliers to source a certain proportion of the energy that they supply to consumers from renewable sources. There have been voluntary agreements, the climate change agreements associated with the climate change levy, which is a tax that was on the previous slide, and various labels, information, education, publicity campaigns. So we could spend at least 2 hours, and at some lectures I do spend 2 hours talking about such things, but not today. The purpose of those slides is simply to show that there's a lot going on. The energy market reform, I'm glad the Queen's speech yesterday mentioned energy market reform. In fact, it stated that there particularly would be legislation in this parliamentary session on energy market reforms, and I've put up these 4 bullet points down here are the kinds of things that are being proposed, and indeed they were all in the Queen's speech. Just very quickly, what are the first two of those, which are the ones that are likely to be most important in terms of stimulating investment in the electricity market, well, that's what's happened to the carbon price in the EU emissions trading scheme, which was the thing that was supposed to have driven low carbon investment. And you can see that while most informed commentators think that we need a carbon price of about 30 up here, it has only ever hit that at one point just before the crash, and that it's currently down at about 7. And nobody imagines that that is going to drive low carbon investment. So the government has proposed, through this is one of the energy market reform measures, that it will support the carbon price by imposing a tax, and the tax will be this black component on top of the EU emissions trading price, such that the carbon price will be £13 per tonne in 2013 and will rise to £30 a tonne in 2020. So there is your tax, sir. That's what the government is proposing. It was announced in the budget last year, confirmed in the budget this year, and the tax for 2013 has already been, and 2014 have already been announced. It would be much better if this could be introduced at a European level. I'm not going to go into the details and the complexities of why that isn't likely to be possible. The second of the energy market reforms, again rather complicated little diagram, but perhaps worth just explaining very briefly, is this feed-in tariff with a contract for difference. If you look at the Financial Times today, you'll see a little explanation of that. But basically what it is that low carbon energy generators will sell their energy into the grid as they normally do, their electricity into the grid, but they will be guaranteed a certain price. And this example, they're guaranteed a price of between 60 and 70 pounds per megawatt hour, and they will be paid by consumers or by the electricity suppliers who buy it. They will actually be paid the green amount on top of whatever they get through the wholesale electricity market. So that's what the contract for difference means. It means that they have a contract whereby they're guaranteed a certain price which will give them this difference over the actual annual price.
This is renewable energy.
Well, no, it's most controversially, it is renewable, yes, and it will replace the renewables obligation, but it will also apply to nuclear, which is why it's being introduced instead of the renewables obligation, which only applies to renewables. So this will apply, which is why I've been talking about low carbon electricity, because it will also apply to nuclear electricity. And of course, despite the words that politicians say, that amounts to a subsidy for nuclear, despite the fact that part of the coalition agreement was that nuclear would not be subsidised. I think people should come clean and say it is being subsidised, and then we can discuss whether or not that's a good thing. We might like to discuss that. So you can see there's been no shortage of action. Has it been effective? Well, it hasn't been terribly effective, to be honest. Over the 10 years from 1997 to 2007, emissions in the UK actually went up, and that was when most of those policies were in place. Why have they gone down since 1990? Well, they've largely gone down because gas was substituted for coal, and because we had a recession in 2009, which everyone will have noticed, which knocked 10% off our carbon emissions, which is really rather a lot. So we're going to have to apply these policies much more stringently if we are to meet those targets, especially the ones for 2025. The two questions that poses for me as an economist are what are the implications for economic growth, and what will be the costs of these policies, and then thinking about the political feasibility. Now, there's a huge amount of evidence on that, and I'm not going to be able to go into it in any sort of detail. As with everything else economic, there are two schools of thought, and economists disagree quite violently with each other about what it's going to cost. There are the pessimists who say it's going to cost an arm and a leg because we're substituting cheap energy, which is a fundamental input into the economy, for more expensive energy, and that is bound, they say, to reduce economic growth substantially. Then there are the optimists who cite a whole range of reasons as to why economic growth is unlikely to be much affected. Nick Stern is very much in the optimist camp. If you read his report, I would probably put myself in that camp as well. Many of the pessimists are on the other side of the Atlantic, and that's one of the reasons why they're so far not done anything about climate change policy. As I say, when I'm doing presentations on this theme, I have large numbers of slides and graphs and things that give what I take to be the evidence for these various considerations as to why we can expect the costs of substantial climate change mitigation to be relatively modest, but we won't be able to go into those. A lot of that is modelling. I regret that really, because these models are always wrong, but some of them are useful, and they enable you to think in a relatively rigorous way about what's going on. But from a very exhaustive analysis of the evidence, this was Nick Stern's conclusion as to what the costs of meeting this level of atmospheric concentration of CO2 were likely to be. He thought it was going to be an annual cost of 1% of GDP, with a range of plus or minus 3. He's since said that that's likely to be over-optimistic, and I would agree with him, partly because we've now decided that 500 to 550 is not enough. We've got to get below that in order to keep average global warming to below 2 degrees. So that will obviously increase the cost somewhat. But let's just go to this one. My conclusion on the evidence of this is that it's broadly between 1 and 4% of GDP, and we'll come back and think in a minute what that might mean in real terms. I'm struck by your emphasis on pictures. You see, I've got a lot of pictures, but some of them are quite complicated here. What this slide shows, which was in the Stern Review report, so you can read up Stern's description of it if you're interested. Every one of these little dots is a different model run of a reduction of carbon emissions from some baseline. And there were 4 big exercises with lots of different models with these different coloured dots, and there you can see them. And you can see that a few models are extremely optimistic and think that by cutting carbon emissions we can actually have significant increases in GDP, because GDP is on this vertical axis. But most of the models think that by cutting carbon emissions by, say, 70 or 80%, which is the sort of number that we're talking about by 2050, we're going to have reductions in GDP. But at the same time, they're not huge reductions in GDP. In fact, the majority of the dots out here, you can see they fall between about 1 and 4%. So there was Stern saying he thought it was 1 plus or minus 3. I think it's more likely to be a range of 1 to 4. In other words, it's the upper part of the Stern range. Well, what does that mean to real people? Well, what it means, if we go back to this slide, is that in the days when the economy was growing at about 3% per annum, which we hope we might get back to at some point, but it's clearly not doing that at the moment, the trajectory of the economy without any kind of climate change action might be this red line. So up it goes, and so that by 2030, it's something like 80% higher than it is now, because that's what 3% year on year would more or less give us. If we now build in climate change mitigation, so the reduction of carbon emissions, as in that following slide, the one I've just shown you, we might lose 3% of that. And this is just to keep the numbers simple. I've said between 1 and 4, let's take 3. Well, what that means is, with an economy growing at 3% a year, that the economy will reach in 2031, with reduced climate emissions, the level that it would have reached in 2030. What effectively we've done, and what the loss of 3% of GDP means, is that we've had to wait a year in order to reach the level of GDP, which is the level of average incomes, so we're all pretty interested in that, the level of incomes that we would have had the year before. So that's the question you have to ask yourself as to whether you think it's worth paying that kind of cost in order to mitigate climate change. Given that Stern thinks climate change could cost us 20% of GDP, you can imagine that I come down as a rational kind of economic person on the basis that, yes, this is a cost worth paying. I'm happy to wait until 2031 to reach the income that I would otherwise have had in 2030 if I can be assured that we're going to have a stable climate. So, I'm not going to spend any time at all. These are my slides on the work that I've done on green taxes, which is quite extensive, as you can see. And there are a couple of books that I've written about the subject because I think it's quite an important subject, but we don't really have time to go into that. So, here are the conclusions on the economic costs of doing stuff in respect of climate change. I've already said that I think Stern's central estimate is on the low side, but its upper range is certainly consistent with the evidence. And that's losing between 1 and 4% of GDP. There's absolutely no evidence anywhere on either side of the Atlantic or in any studies that I've ever been able to discover that the costs are going to be very much greater than that, and none at all that economic growth will somehow stop altogether. So the whole kind of limits to growth thing, that we can't have growth if we're going to do something about climate change, I simply don't buy at all. This environmental tax reform, which is what I didn't have time to talk about and skipped over, which is basically a shift in the burden of taxation from labour and capital, which is where it currently is, to the use of energy and resources. So we're not talking about increasing the burden of taxation, we're talking about shifting it. That is an absolutely critical measure in order to start pushing the innovation process in the right direction. And as I say, there are those books, and there's no evidence that that policy has any economic cost at all. The two slides which I skipped over, which I'll cover very quickly. 6 countries have already implemented this policy in a small way, and there they are, they're all European countries. The UK is actually one of them, with the climate change levy, which we introduced in 2001, but there's Denmark, Netherlands, Finland, Sweden and Germany. These are not the basket cases of Europe. And in the introduction of this policy, and this was evaluated in very great detail through a European research project, you can see that their greenhouse gases were reduced in different ways by different amounts, while their GDP slightly increased as a result of that policy. Now this is very small. No one says that this is going to kick-start growth or do any of those other things that chancellors would like, but what it does show is that we can reduce these greenhouse gases without negative effects on the economy. And in subsequent work I've investigated the question about what would happen. These were rather small environmental tax reforms. They still gave us about 6% reduction in carbon emissions, which is not insignificant. But if we were to do that on a much larger scale, I've investigated what might happen. So that's this environmental tax reform policy, a crucial policy approach for cost-effective carbon reduction in my view. And I'd like to spend my last 2 minutes just asking the question, well, if this is right and the economic costs are rather small, why is this so difficult? And you only have to read the newspapers on any particular day to find out that politicians are actually finding this pretty tough. So, the costs are small, but it's politically very difficult. Why? Well, the first reason is summed up in these slides. It's nothing to do with technologies. We've got the technologies there. It's a question of rolling them out. There are obviously issues to do with aesthetics of onshore wind, etc., and various other issues to do with nuclear, but the technologies are basically there. Government will need to fund RD&D. Well, it is doing that. But in order to get these technologies on the ground at scale, we're going to need very, very large sums of investment. The number that our energy regulator Ofgem puts about is something like 200 billion by 2020 in the electricity system alone. And clearly that money is not going to come out of government, out of taxes. We are not able to do that, so it's going to have to come from the private sector. And the private sector will only do it if it thinks it will make money out of doing it. And that investment need not have any negative impact on GDP, but what it will require is higher savings and lower consumption, because an economy only has a certain number of resources. They're divided between consumption and investment, and we have become a consumer society. Our savings rate in 2008, before the crash, actually fell below zero, which meant that we were nationally saving a negative quantity. We were kind of not only not generating any seed corn for next year, but eating the seed corn that we had generated in previous years. Not all economies are like that. China, which is a much poorer country, currently has a savings rate of something like 40%. Victorian Britain had a savings rate of something like 40%, despite the fact, as we know from the novels of Charles Dickens, quite a lot of people would have liked to have consumed a little more. So it is possible to increase savings rates, but in a consumer society, it is not popular. And one of the things that we're witnessing with this resistance to higher energy prices is consumer resistance to higher investment in the energy system, because these higher energy prices are going straight back to the energy companies so that they can invest in these more expensive forms of low carbon energy. The other issue is the lifestyle issue. In order to stimulate this investment, we will need higher energy prices. The market is doing that to some extent, but not adequately for the investment that we need. But we're already seeing consumers getting very excited about the size of energy prices and the way that that affects them and prevents them from doing things they want to do, like drive cars and fly around the world on foreign holidays. We still have a trend that more people are flying more often for shorter breaks around the world. So that kind of lifestyle development is still progressing, notwithstanding the austerity and the lack of economic growth generally. And clearly that is not compatible with reducing carbon emissions in the long term. And were aviation to become so expensive that people couldn't do that, we could expect some political resistance. So it's the shift from consumption to investment and the necessary shift to low carbon lifestyles, which is why I'm so interested in the behaviour change side of things now, that is required and which at the moment is not kind of in prospect. And this is my concluding slide. We need to shift the direction of innovation, and that will need to be done by differences in relative prices. This could set off a whole new wave of economic growth, and there are lots of interesting theories about the cycles of economic growth that have occurred in the past. It's not technology or cost that is the principal barrier to making that change happen, but politics. People's attachment to consumption rather than savings and investment, and to high carbon lifestyles. And if we want to reduce emissions on a large scale, we're going to have to change that political reality. Green growth will not happen without that, and yet, paradoxically, it's only persuading people that green growth is possible that will encourage policymakers, especially in developing countries, but also in our own countries, to undertake this experiment at all. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much. I hope we might have time for a little bit of discussion.
Paul, thank you for that. The UK government likes to claim it's a world leader, and it does that on the basis of the fact that its carbon emissions are 23% lower than they were in 1990, and the fact that they're going for 80% reduction by 2050. But of course, setting a target, 40 years away doesn't cost a penny. And the reduction of 23% was not achieved by any conversion to renewable energy or to energy conservation. It was achieved by converting from one fossil fuel to another. They also achieved it by exporting their carbon footprint, so that if you actually take that into account, UK carbon emissions haven't gone down 23%, they've actually gone up 20%. So do you think the UK government is a world leader in climate change mitigation?
Yes,
Why?
I do, because it's doing more than anybody else.
What, more than Germany?
Pretty well in terms of emissions, and in terms of emissions cuts, and in terms of the kinds of targets which are not, as I've explained, just for 2050. They are for these 5-yearly periods, and the projections suggest that we are on track for that. This is the most difficult time for these trajectories. You're probably aware there's an enormous amount of pressure for us to invest in another round of gas-fired power stations. If we do that, then we won't meet the targets.
No.
And so there's a very clear line in the sand there. I was interested to see the head of the Environment Agency, Lord Smith, calling for more gas, which the newspapers reported very widely.
Was that based on a report he's done, or where did that come from?
Well, that's just based on, I think, him deciding he needed to make a pronouncement on a controversial area.
It was a personal view, was it?
Well, it's head of the Environment Agency point of view, chairman of the Environment Agency.
But he's supposed to be independent. It's not his job to say what UK's energy policy should be.
But it's a little more than personal.
Why?
What he said was, well, because he was speaking on behalf of his institution.
But they haven't done a study or a report, so how does he speak on their behalf?
He will have assessed the studies and the reports that have been done. What was not reported, but what he said was that this new investment of gas should be accompanied with carbon capture and storage, and obviously were that to be the case, and were carbon capture and storage to work, then that would indeed be consistent with the carbon emission reductions. Unfortunately, those are two big ifs. We don't know whether it will be accompanied by carbon capture and storage, and indeed we don't know if carbon capture and storage is going to work. And I would have thought it would have been prudent for Lord Smith to have kept his counsel until we had some sense as to whether carbon capture and storage for gas-fired power stations was something that were going to be installed. So my kind of criticism, for what it's worth, is really that what was reported is that we should have more gas, and there's plenty of people who think that. He also said carbon capture and storage, but that's a very uncertain part of the equation still.
Well, he also said you have to control fugitive emissions of methane as well, which is another area that would put the price up for shale gas.
Well, indeed it would.
And it's a question of whether shale gas is going to be acceptable to the British public, because they're going to have they're going to have wellheads all over our green and pleasant land.
Well, indeed.
And toxic ponds full of undeclared chemicals.
I mean, the good thing about the wellheads is that they're there for a relatively short period of time.
Unlike wind farms.
Then they have to move on because the particular field that they exploit gets depleted quite quickly. So, but that's they would then move on.
Can I mean, you say Germany isn't ahead of us. I mean, our renewable contribution is less than 4%, which is the worst in Europe apart from Malta, whereas Germany's over 20%. So how can you say they're doing better than us?
I was talking in terms of emissions reduction, and in terms of emissions reduction, we're broadly comparable. I was also saying that the UK is a world leader. I didn't say the world leader.
Right.
And when you look at what most other countries are doing, which is not much, and outside Europe it's practically nothing, then there's 5 or 6 countries in Europe and 1 or 2 countries outside that have, and I'm thinking particularly of Australia here, that have sort of shown a lot of political courage, 2 governments having fallen in Australia on this issue, and the third one having introduced its carbon tax and emission trading scheme at enormous political cost. I mean, this is tough stuff.
Yeah.
But I think the government can legitimately claim to be a world leader. In order to be the world leader, you would have to define the metrics against which you are assessing that a little more carefully.
Well, Sweden has over 40% renewable, so they could qualify as a world leader.
They could indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, they also have a very small population and an awful lot of forest and water, and that helps.
And we've got a lot of wind, tidal, and all the rest of it.
We
don't use it.
But forests and water are much easier to capture than wind and tidal and waves.
So Ofgem say 200 billion. I mean, that presumably is assuming that we double our electricity demand, does it? Where's that 200 billion come from?
No, most of the 200 billion is investment that we need to replace power stations.
Okay.
Most of the power stations, nuclear and coal, are going to close over the next 10 years, and that number includes replacing them, but it's also extra transmission lines in order to get the wind from the north of Scotland, where it is, into the demand centres of the south, and so there's something like 14 to 17 billion that is being planned on new transmission lines, subsea cables of various kinds around the two east and west coasts of the UK. Then there's investment also into buildings, which is included in that 200 billion to make them more energy efficient.
Yeah. Green Deal and stuff.
So, and then there is the incremental low carbon stuff, because it's more expensive to replace the power stations with low carbon than it would with others.
Well, it wouldn't be more expensive if the fossil fuel generators had to pay for the damage they do. I mean, the trouble is that the Maldives don't charge them for drowning their island, do they? If they had to pay that cost, it wouldn't be so cheap.
I mean, that's what this carbon support price that I showed is intended to move towards.
Right.
If the question which I was asked to address is the UK government doing enough to achieve its contribution to an 80% reduction by 2050, the answer is probably no.
Okay. I agree with that.
But there is another question, which is, could it do more? And the answer to that is also probably no, given the political realities that I touched on right at the end.
Well, that's because the Treasury's rowing in the opposite direction to DEC and DEFRA, isn't it?
It's also because consumers are rowing in the opposite direction of what they like.
Yeah, but that's because they're being misinformed by... Yes, anyway, go on. The Friends of the Treasury. Peter.
That's really good. It's going to say that was terrific. Thank you. First of all, you've made me think about 20 points. So starting with Sweden, one of the differences with Sweden and energy is that industry is taxed less for their use of energy, and private homes are taxed more. And it's accepted in Sweden that that's the way it works. And it happens, and it's effective. They're very effective in their replacement of renewables. And actually, I think that's something we should think about in this country. But it's difficult to sell. And one of the problems that I made the point before, Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII. It's the big example, perhaps Goebbels would be a similar example, where Henry VIII wanted to get divorced, and he had a very clever man called Thomas More, and before him Wolsey, who couldn't sell the idea to the people that mattered in the country. And then along came Thomas Cromwell, who said, you've got to find a reason that signifies to the people that matter. And as soon as he found the reason that signified, it was sold. Henry got divorced, Carl found it in his head, got divorced and then got married, a few more. The trouble is that we're getting far too complex in our arguments. People who matter, which is actually nearly everybody, can't understand it. That's the problem. When you use the word carbon when you could use fossil fuels, actually, I think you don't do a service to the argument. I don't mean this critically. I mean it's not a service to the argument. It has to be simple arguments. And one of the things we've got now is frightfully, I say, are they doing enough? I say they're doing too much. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times, a tale of two cities. They're doing too many things, but they're not doing anything enough. So for me, you would have very simple things. What we have at the moment is we leave behind cheap ways of saving carbon emissions, and we indulge in expensive ways of doing it, like offshore wind. If we do that, we make ourselves uncompetitive with the Far East, we get unemployment, we import the emissions anyway, as Robin has said. We need to make maximum effect of efficiency. And when you get the carbon figure that you mentioned, it's too slow. Unfortunately, we need to actually have something which signifies that's bigger now. People don't have to suffer, but they have to feel how they can get the benefit. And that's why I say give them a benefit and give them a bigger tax, and they can keep the benefit if they do something about it. And increase the tax if the result isn't enough, and decrease the tax if it's too much. And then they can see the benefit in both ways. And that is a very simple thing that people will understand. I don't think people really deeply understand it. They need it in pictures. They don't need it in arguments. And it could be achieved. I mean, I spoke this morning, you weren't here, about, I've got an anaerobic digestion plant in Holsworthy in Devon. All the waste heat goes into the air. I get nothing if I use that waste heat to save fossil fuels. I get nothing for that. Could easily do it. I can save 1,500,000 litres of oil a year by collecting that heat. But I can't make a financial reason to do it. Whereas if we had a high enough tax now, everything would be on a level playing field. We wouldn't get indulgences in offshore wind, which is too expensive, and exporting our emissions to elsewhere and creating unemployment. So I say level, simple. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Okay. Yes, the UK, I mean, your first point, the UK is unique in having a much lower tax rate, energy and carbon tax rate on households than it has on industry. All the other countries I showed there that have introduced these reforms have put the major burden on households and a lesser burden on industry for competitiveness reasons. We have still a very low burden on energy-intensive industries through the climate change agreements, but for the rest of industry, they're the people carrying the major tax. The reason for that is quite simply that our building stock is in such a terrible condition. If the Swedes had our building stock, they would have died because it's cold in Sweden in winter. We used to have very cheap energy when most of our building stock was built. We didn't bother with building regulations until what was it, early 1980s or whatever it was, when Sweden obviously had been doing it for decades. And the result is that we have this phenomenon called fuel poverty, which the only other country in Europe that expresses it in those terms is Ireland, and they have very similar problems to ours in this respect. So that's why it's very difficult for us to increase household energy prices. Go straight back to the previous presentation, of course, why don't we improve the energy efficiency of the building stock? And this comes to your second point, which is, why don't we do the cheap things first? Well, ever since I've looked at this economically, all the numbers suggest that doing buildings is relatively cheap, certainly much cheaper than offshore wind, for example, which is why most recently government is really putting a lot of effort into this. And again, the problem is that the economics and the politics are not aligned. It may be economically quite cheap if you could get people to do it, but getting people to do it is extraordinarily difficult, and is, especially in a cultural context where we can't regulate private householders. An Englishman's home is his castle, and you'll have seen this thing that the previous speaker referred to as a conservatory tax. It was nothing of the kind. It was simply a proposed regulation that when you do something to your home that extends it, you should also do simple energy efficiency measures to the rest of your home, which will actually save you money. Now, the media we have completely misrepresented that proposal. and called it a conservatory tax, when it wasn't actually going to apply to conservatories at all. But I'm afraid that's the kind of newspapers which we have. And the government looks as if it might retreat from it. Whether it will or not remains to be seen. But that's the difficulty, that if people were to do these things to their homes, it would be relatively cheap, but so far no government has managed to persuade them to do it. And until they do things to their homes, it's proving impossible to put the energy prices up because of the damage it would do to low-income households.
You could load the tax. You could make it more expensive the more they use.
Well,
then you protect the low energy.
And that leads us straight into the next question, which is simplicity. Of course, everyone wants a simple policy. I have never heard anybody say, I want a complex policy. And yet, when you look at this policy landscape, it is very complex. Why? Well, the reason is that whenever a policy is proposed, like the carbon tax, all sorts of people jump up and they say, yes, I want a simple policy, so I like this, but it's got to be simple, it's got to work for me as well. And the only way it can work for this very wide range of people is to introduce all sorts of complexities. So if we're talking about a carbon tax, then we need to involve the benefit system in order to give rebates to all sorts of people who don't have a lot of money. Now, anyone who knows anything about the benefit system is that it's complex.
You don't need benefits. You just do it on the fuel bill. You just say the first,
yes,
however many units it is, you charge a certain price, and then the more you use, the higher the price.
Yes, but
we do it with income tax. It's not that complicated.
Well, it is extremely complicated because people have looked at this in an enormous amount of detail, and you never know how fast the energy price should raise. If you go in steps, then you have a certain step for a lower price in certain steps.
That's detail. That's all detail.
No, but policy is all about detail. The devil in policy is always in the detail, which is why we end up with complicated policies.
No, what you need is leadership. That's what you need, leadership. There's a lack of leadership.
I accept that. All I'm trying to do is explain the landscape that we've got. It is clearly possible to resolve these issues, but it is not proving possible to resolve these issues given the levels of complexity required and the kinds of political the kinds of politics and communications that go on around these areas. I think I've kind of answered the points that you raised, probably not adequately. I'm working on a research project at the moment for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is specifically looking at that issue. If we were to put VAT up to 20%, we subsidise household consumption of fossil fuels. We not only don't tax it, we subsidise it because it has a lower VAT rate than anywhere else in the economy. If we were to put VAT up to 20%, that would be an enormous slug of money that would go into the Treasury. What could the Treasury do with that slug of money in order to ensure that vulnerable and low-income households were not worse off?
Well, my answer is that everybody, I'm over 65, I'm afraid, or is it even 60? Maybe I get a long time, and I get is it 200?
You get a winter fuel payment, yes.
I get a winter fuel allowance, I don't, anyway.
Well, this is obviously crazy, but it was politically very popular. Gordon Brown hung his hat on it and was absolutely immovable on the subject. And before Cameron was elected, in one of the prime ministerial debates, Gordon Brown asked him categorically, he challenged him and said, "You're going to remove the winter fuel payment, aren't you?" And in the run-up to the election, that was electoral suicide, so Cameron said, "Oh, no, I'm not going to touch winter fuel payment." So this £2 or £3 billion a year that goes to people like you and me, because I'm also over 60, which absolutely I don't need, is untouchable for political electoral reasons.
What I would say to you is that you do need it, and that everybody should get it. Everybody, every man, woman and child should get a winter fuel allowance. If they do their insulation and everything else, they'll keep it, they won't spend it. And they won't be any worse off, and the government won't be any worse off because it's collected its 20% tax. And it's used it that way, and then there's a big incentive to people.
Well, it's actually quite a small incentive if you divide your winter fuel, what's being paid in the winter. with the winter fuel payment, you divide that by 60 million, then it's not a large sum of money, unfortunately.
No, but
So-
collecting 20, putting the fuel tax up, the VAT up to 20%,
Yes, that would
collect a lot of money.
It would collect a lot.
And if it was given back to everybody as a winter fuel allowance,
Yes.
then people who take action to save the amount of energy they use will keep the money and they can go on holiday or something. And,
Yep.
and those that don't,
Indeed.
the fuel poverty won't be increased, but the incentive to do something about the amount of energy, wear a jersey sometimes, get the wife to close the window,
Indeed.
all that sort
I
of
can
stuff.
guarantee that you would be able to find, and the newspapers would find, little old ladies living in rooms who are using so much energy that they would not be adequately compensated, because I've done the sums, and that would generate political controversy. I agree with you. I'm not arguing with you.
No.
I mean, I'm trying to understand why it doesn't happen, while arguing that it should happen, and trying to find ways of using the amounts of money that would be available. I think from VAT it would be something like 10 billion, and if you divide 10 billion by the 20 million households that you've got, yes, you have a few £1,000s, but actually you would need to spend more than that on most homes in order to bring their energy efficiency up to the requirements.
Felicity, you've been waiting patiently.
Hi Paul, I'm Felicity. I've been attending all week and my comment's going to be a little bit about what you've said, but in relation to the whole week. And I always bang on about how I'm from New Zealand, but one thing I've noticed since I came here about a year and a half ago is that every single day I have hay fever or a sniffly nose, things that I don't usually have to deal with. And to me that's a pretty obvious sign that something is really wrong. And I do spend all my time in the city, but I fail to see how your everyday Londoners are not bothered by the fact that they're constantly sniffling on the public transport and are being bothered by pollution. And I can see it pretty clearly. I don't know why it's quite so bad. I'm 100,000,000% behind everybody doing something about it. But I do think the complacency in the general public is very strong. And it worries me as somebody who's come here with a fresh eye. Just all the little things in the daily lives that people haven't got time to notice about themselves, and the easy things that could be done that lead to the things they could do in their own homes, that lead to the bigger companies that can do things to help us.
What do you think about that,
That's
Paul?
my biggest observation of the week.
Thank you.
I'm quite pessimistic, but I do think something can be done, and I hope to be hay fever free by the time I leave London in a few years' time.
Paul?
Right, well you probably know more about the hay fever issue than I do, but what I do know about the hay fever issue is that it's a very complicated issue and that we don't yet fully understand precisely what it is that causes it. I mean, you may be talking more about asthma than hay fever, and we know that asthma is considerably more than it was, but we don't know exactly why. We think all sorts of potential possibilities. One of the reasons why Londoners are less concerned about air pollution than you are is because air pollution is actually lower than it was. We used to have very high air pollution, and it has gone down with some exceptions. Nitrogen dioxide has gone down less than others. Particulates are still a little bit of still a concern and went down a lot, but are now starting to go up. But Londoners kind of remember what it was like to some extent, and most of them get by without the kind of symptoms that you're talking about. I'm not saying they're not important, they're enormously important. Air pollution across Europe shortens the lives of some 300,000 people a year, so it's a big current issue, and of course it's entirely, or almost entirely, related to the use of fossil fuels in transport and the fact that we have so many cars on our streets. That again goes back to one of the drivers of climate change, which is our infatuation with motor cars and the difficulty of doing anything about them, even in a city like London, which has a fantastic public transport system, where no one, apart from disabled people, actually need a car. And yet, I lived through the introduction of the congestion charge some years ago, which was obviously a very good policy measure, and from the coverage of it in the Evening Standard, which most Londoners read, you would have thought the world as we know it was about to come to an end. And it very nearly didn't get introduced precisely for that reason. Now that it has been introduced, we can't imagine what we would have done without it. And public transport has been improved very greatly by the money that it generated, which has allowed a huge investment in public transport. So, I mean, that has been a response. If you'd lived in London before the congestion charge, you'd have found it considerably worse, both in terms of air quality and in terms of traffic. But obviously there's room for huge further improvement, and our current mayor, who unfortunately has just been re-elected, doesn't help, because the congestion charge was due to be rolled out further to the west of London, and the first thing he did last time he was elected was to cancel that. Yeah. So, you know, this is politics again. People love their cars, and any kind of constraint on how they should use them, even in an urban area when they don't need to use them, and when they do inflict these kinds of costs on people like yourself, that is a difficult thing for politicians to tackle.
Well, just on that, I mean, I gave evidence to the House of Lords Select Committee on the European Communities in 1984, and I was worried then about traffic pollution, vehicle pollution, and I said that one of the explanations for the difference in lung cancer rates between urban and rural areas in non-smokers might be vehicle pollution, and that was regarded as pretty heretical at the time, but that is now accepted by the medical fraternity some 2 decades later. As far as hay fever and asthma is concerned, it may be that the pollutants sensitize your airways to the things like grass and pollen and all the rest of it that cause hay fever. That's a perfectly good explanation of why people who are in cities get more than they do when they're in the country.
There's a gentleman here who's been waiting.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Hello.
My name is Kai from Total Eco Management, Kai Bowman. My question is, do you have a view on whether the UK should position mandatory corporate reporting as Section 84 of the Climate Change Act, a decision which the government was to make last month? This would support my colleague's view at the front that actions needed now that is measurable and displays leadership across business and government.
In a word, yes. I do support mandatory corporate reporting of environmental impact, and it is extraordinary to me that we've been talking about this for at least 10 years, and governments have been shilly-shallying about it for that length of time, and it's still not going through, and we're still shying away from it. Until these kinds of things are mandatory, then people won't be persuaded that they are important and should be taken seriously. And so they should be mandatory.
Could I ask, can I just clarify the nuclear and the extent of the subsidies? Because I suspect that some of the subsidies going into the nuclear programme are sort of hidden. I mean, you mentioned that the feed-in tariff now includes nuclear, whereas previously it didn't. Yeah. The cost of waste disposal of our current stockpile of nuclear waste, according to Gordon McCarran, who chaired the committee, is over £100 billion. Recently, EDF and Centrica, I believe, have persuaded the government that the taxpayer should fund the cost of the insurance in the event of a nuclear accident. And is there any subsidy going into the construction of new nuclear build at the moment?
No.
No.
There isn't.
Okay.
And just, I mean, a few other kind of random observations. There is no doubt at all that the last round of nuclear power stations was a complete financial disaster for the UK taxpayer. Some numbers that I've seen, which I can't verify, are that 80% of the current budget of the Department of Energy and Climate Change, 80%, is being spent on cleaning up and decommissioning the last round of nuclear power stations.
From the 70s?
From the 70s, the 80s, the 90s.
Well, there weren't any in the 80s and 90s.
Well, yes.
Well, the size will be.
Well, no. I mean, they were all operating.
Oh, I see.
They're now being decommissioned.
Yeah, okay.
The Magnox and the advanced gas cool reactors, they're now being decommissioned. And the committee that Gordon McCarran was chairman of which looked into the nuclear waste and how to get rid of it. So that the numbers there are simply mind-boggling. The last time I looked, it's something like 72 billion is going to be spent. This is money that was not charged to electricity consumers when we consumed it. I'm looking at the older members of the audience. We consumed that electricity, we enjoyed that electricity, we did not pay for it, and that is now having to come out of current taxpayers' income, which is precisely the kind of thing that we do not want. Now, that generation of nuclear power stations was also subsidised in terms of insurance. All nuclear power stations around the world are subsidised in terms of insurance, because it is recognised that no private company would be able to pay the costs of a major accident. And we've seen proof positive of that again at Fukushima, where if the government hadn't picked up the bill, the Tokyo Electric Power Company would obviously simply have gone bust. So all countries do that. It is of course a subsidy. No one knows quite how much subsidy it is, because there's no insurance company in the world that would offer private insurance for an unlimited accident. So we don't know what these guys would have to pay if they were to cover their insurance liabilities, like every other power generator has to. So we don't know what the subsidy is, but it's clearly potentially very large indeed, as we've seen in Japan. And on the subject of the waste disposal and the decommissioning costs of the proposed new power stations, it is said that the nuclear companies that build those power stations will have to make payments into a fund which in due time will grow the way funds are supposed to grow, such that in 50 or 100 years' time they will be able to pay their decommissioning costs. I haven't yet seen the institutional mechanisms for that fund, but what I know is that following various financial collapses and everything, a lot of funds that we thought were worth a lot of money turned out to be worth rather little money. And the UK's experience in this field is not encouraging. We instituted the fossil fuel levy in the early 1990s, which was a 10% tax on electricity on all consumers, specifically to pay for the decommissioning costs of the current generation of power stations. But that money was simply spent by the power companies, so that not one penny of it remains or is available to pay for the decommissioning costs, which are now having to be paid for by current taxpayers out of current income. So we haven't got a good track record at holding the nuclear industry to account. And to me, before we engage in a new round of nuclear power stations, I would want to be far more reassured than I am that we've actually sorted out those problems.
Well, actually, if you go back to Flower's report in '76,
Of course.
he said we shouldn't have any more nuclear build until we've solved the problem of waste disposal.
Which we haven't.
And nobody's got near to that. I
So-
think we'll have to probably stop and thank Paul for an absolutely fascinating talk and a very, very illuminating question and answer session. Thank you very much.